All right, happy Sunday, everybody. Glad that you are here today. If you're visiting, we hope you feel like family while you're here. We hope we get to know you a little bit better in between our Bible class and worship time. We are in John chapter 2 for the sermon today, and we're going to relate just a little bit to John chapter 2. Again, what I try to do in the Bible class on Sunday mornings is not recover what we do in the sermon, it's to kind of add to it. Years ago, I was at a church, and there were a lot of different reasons why we did it, but we flipped our time together. And a lot of churches will do, okay, Bible class and then worship, right? We flipped it around, and we did worship first, and then we did a Bible class. And what happened was I spent most of the Bible class, even though I'd prepared something else, I spent most of the time answering questions about the sermon, so we just turned the class into what I called sermon notes. Answer any questions about the sermon, because everybody had heard it, anything that I left out of my sermon that I couldn't fit in there, for time's sake or whatever, we just cover that extra stuff. So that's kind of what we do here, is just some of the stuff that kind of runs parallel, runs along with it, but not exactly the same. I've mentioned before that John does an awful lot with his Old Testament. He is a master of weaving the Old Testament into narratives, into stories. He doesn't so much quote the Old Testament. He does occasionally, but what he's really good at doing is telling a story and weaving language into it. For instance, if I were to tell you about us going to Walmart, and it was a horrible trip because Walmart, And at the beginning of it, I would stop and I would say, just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip. Now, if you're a certain age, you get that. Reminder, set up all those medical screenings that we need to do. But you'll get that, right? And so in that instance, I quoted it, right? Okay? But what I could do is say, well, we got in the car one day and headed to Walmart. Now, did I quote it? Did I allude to it and reference it all over it where it sounds an awful lot like it? Okay. All right. That's what John is a master of doing. He takes the Old Testament, he takes the prophets, he takes the Exodus narrative, and he just weaves it into the way he tells his stories about Jesus. He does it masterfully. How do I put this? The most Old Testament heavy book in your New Testament is Revelation. All over it are hyperlinks to your Old Testament. Never once does John quote the Old Testament in Revelation. Never once. But he uses language, he uses images, he uses the tune of a lot of texts in the Old Testament to tell you what's going on and what's going to happen. And so John does that in his gospel. And if you're really familiar with the stories, if you're really familiar with your Old Testament, which, let's be honest, we studied things like civics and government and math and English and science. This is what we studied in school, right? Anybody have to memorize Leviticus in school? Okay, all of John's audience, well, the Jewish part of it did. Okay? Your school, your training on how to do life was memorizing and learning your Bible. So when he starts, everybody in the room knows exactly what he's doing. It resonates with them. We miss a lot of it. Okay, and that doesn't mean that John is not powerful, that John's not effective. God's word never returns void, period. But we get so much more out of it when we realize what he's doing with the Old Testament story. So, in John chapter 2, we get a story of Jesus turning water to wine. And this comes after the fact that John has done his great poetic introduction of Jesus, right? And I don't remember if it was last week or the week before because, it's all just a blur. We ended up looking at John chapter 1, verse 14. And we ended up talking about how that verse, actually, let's just look at it real quick. Turning your Bible over to John chapter 1. I'll get back there John chapter 1, by the way, is falling out of my Bible. I have to be really careful when I turn over to John's gospel that I don't finish ripping the pages out here. John 1 verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his tabernacle, dwelling. John takes the word for tabernacle and turns it into a verb. He pitched his tent. He camped among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And if you were here, whatever week that was that we did this, we ended up looking at Exodus chapter 33 and 34, the story where God reveals himself to Moses. And as he does that, he says his name is Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God. Our God is full of grace, abounding in love, and most English translations will say faithfulness, although that word in your Old Testament is just as commonly transferred as truthfulness. So God introduces himself to Moses as the God of grace and truth. And now here in John chapter 1, we have seen his glory. Well, Moses only got to get a glimpse of God's glory. But us, we've seen it. And grace and truth comes through Jesus. Now, can you walk away from this and go, okay, we receive grace from Jesus and what he says is true? Absolutely. Is that true? Absolutely. But what John is saying on the lower level, if you really understand Exodus, he's saying we're getting to see what Moses saw, only better. And we see it by looking at Jesus. So, and there's even more to that, but that's not the topic of this class. Okay, stay on track, Matt. All right, so in John chapter 2, we get the story of water to wine. And when I was thinking about this and looking at this, it made me think of another Old Testament text. And we look at it in the sermon. If you were here, we look at Isaiah chapter 25. We'll look at that, again, second service, not in the Bible class. But it made me think of another text too. And it made me think of another text because of what happens. So, John's gospel has 7 signs in it that are specifically referenced as signs that Jesus performs. If you want to count the resurrection as a sign, it's the 8th one. Okay? Jesus is risen from the dead. It's different than Jesus walking into a situation and going, here it is. Okay? 7 signs that get performed by Jesus. It's water to wine, there's healing that happens, there's miraculous feedings that happens. Again, we'll keep looking at these throughout the story. But the first one that John focuses on is water to wine. Now, John is almost certainly writing from Ephesus. What we know from church history and from a couple other little places is that John did an awful lot of ministry in the city of Ephesus. You have a letter in your Bible that is titled Ephesians. Okay, here's the random Bible trivia. The oldest copy we have of Ephesians does not say Ephesians. It's interesting. And P.S., that copy is at the University of Michigan, of all places. The oldest copy we have of Ephesians does not have the word Ephesus in it. And what Paul would often do is he would write letters, and it seems like they would get passed around from church to church. Paul actually writes in one of his letters, hey, go read the letter that I wrote to this other church, and y'all make sure that they get that. They'd pass them around. And so it seems like that letter got passed around, but for whatever reason, it got really associated with the church in Ephesus. Paul does write another letter to somebody in Ephesus. Anybody know off the top of your head, the Bible trivia day, which letter that is? Which letter does Paul write to someone who is in Ephesus? Very good. 1 Timothy, exactly. Timothy is there for a job, and that job is to minister, to lead, to appoint leaders in that church. Deacons and elders, we get a lot of information about that from there. But Timothy is specifically in Ephesus. Pause. And there is some stuff in Timothy that's kind of odd, that if we look at it out of context, it looks very odd. There's some stuff in Timothy that has to do with women's hair and jewelry and the way that they dress. You remember those texts? The weird stuff, and you're like, that's strange. Why that? Okay, how far down the history rabbit trail do we run? There was a Greco-Roman scholar. It's not a Christian at all. The guy celebrates all the Roman and Greek gods. His name is Xenophon. 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 And he wrote a history of Ephesus. And there is a grand temple in Ephesus. If you remember in reading Acts, there is a riot in Ephesus. And they all run into the theater and they start shouting something over and over again because Paul has made such an impact on the word of Jesus that people don't buy the little idols. And so all the silversmiths are mad because they're not selling idols. Do y'all remember what they chanted over and over again? Great is... Oh, I'm hearing it whispered. Great is? Artemis. Artemis of the Ephesians. Artemis was the goddess of bounty and fertility. If you see the statues of her, it's a head and the whole body is breasts. It's weird. First time I saw it, I was going, what is that? And it was, oh. Okay. And the idea is that she's there to nourish anything and everything that needs nourishing. Okay? And you worshiped her through all kinds of weird, perverse, sexual stuff that you would do at the temple. All right? Xenophon in Ephesus writes and describes how this worship of Artemis would happen. Take a wild guess when he describes the priestesses of the temple and of Artemis. Guess how they dressed? Almost word for word what Paul says, don't bring that into the church. The way they wore their hair, the way they wore their jewelry. Again, it's eerie to look at it and go, is this a copy and paste kind of thing? And I think it is, because they're both describing the same thing. Paul's trying to say, look, you guys have left this behind. Don't try to bring that in here and incorporate it into the church. Okay, we'll put a pin in that. So Ephesus is known for its idol worship. We tend to think Artemis, 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 Artemis because, well, that's what the Bible points to. But just as much, they would worship a god named Dionysus. Anybody familiar with Dionysus? The god of wine, exactly right. And Ephesus was wine country back in the day. Not so much today. It was a port city too. Not so much today. It all got silted in. But it was a wine country, and there were great wine producers. And what would happen is different leaders at different times would come through, and they would either think, yay, wine, yay, we're going to support and worship and promote Dionysus, or they would say, you know what, we could make more money for ourselves if we would move the wine production somewhere else in the empire. And so there would be these battles of, are we going pro-wine or against wine in Ephesus. Mark Antony, if you guys are familiar with Mark Antony in history, he actually had a coin minted with Ephesus and Dionysus on it. That's what Ephesus was known for. It was wine country, okay? Now, one of the things that John does in his gospel is the signs that he writes points toward Jesus being better than anything else that the contemporaries would worship. Again, if you're in John's church and it's hard to follow Jesus, all your buddies are going, hey, we're going down to the corner and we're going to worship Dionysus. It's going to be a grand old time. Come on. Well, it's easy to go, well, why not? Sure, I'll go. And what John is trying to do is remind us that's not okay. Jesus is greater and grander than anything Dionysus could do. Now, the stories and the legends around Dionysus is that he provided wine. He was the god of wine. And what would happen is sometimes you would stumble upon something and where did this wine come from? Dionysus. Obviously, he gave us a gift, right? Dionysus always did things in secret, though. He might be there, he might not be there. Wine appeared. It came from Dionysus. She had good crops that year. Well, thank you, Artemis, for sending the rains, but Dionysus was there working on it. I mean, that's, okay. What do you notice about Jesus in this miracle? Is it done in secret? There's witnesses. It's not everybody in the story knows what's happening, but it's public, right? All the servants are involved. Mary gets involved in this. Jesus has all these servants knowing exactly where it's from. John even tells us the servants knew where it was from. And so this isn't hidden somewhere. And it's not just wine, it's the best wine. There's something to this. And it's something that we don't often think about in the Exodus story. I'd like for you to turn over to Exodus chapter 12, please. In Exodus chapter 12, we start seeing an important thing happen. This is the end of the plagues, and it's hinted at a little bit in the previous plagues in Egypt. But we often think about the plagues on Egypt as being against Pharaoh. Pharaoh is hardening his heart. Pharaoh doesn't want to let the people go, therefore God sends a punishment on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Yet what your Old Testament tells is a slightly different story than that. That's, again, how we interpreted it. But God has something a little bit different to say. This is Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12. And this is talking about the final plague, the Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animal, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. Interesting. God sending the plagues in Egypt is God executing judgment not on Pharaoh, not on the people, on the gods of Egypt. Now, we're not going to do this here because time, and this isn't an Exodus study, but when you go through Exodus and you look at all the plagues, they match up very well with the gods that Egypt worships. Let me give you an example that's pretty easy to grasp. The Egyptians worshipped Ra. Anybody know what Ra was the god of? The sun. Is there any kind of plague that happens that deals with the sun? Darkness. Is Ra in charge or is the Lord in charge? Interesting. Okay? There's others. There's gods who provided water. There's gods who have a frog head in Egypt. Do we have a plague that deals with frogs? Oh, we do too, don't we? Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's each one of these plagues can be mapped to an Egyptian god where Yahweh, the God of Israel, is going, you guys think he's in control. I'm telling you, I'm in control of all of it. Pharaoh gets freaked out, goes, please stop. Okay. And then he goes right back to his ways. All right, we'll knock off the next god. And so Yahweh is systematically assassinating, if you will, each one of the Egyptian gods. Just, they can't do anything. They're powerless. And so the ultimate one is the Passover, where who really controls life and death? Well, Pharaoh thought he did. You remember the start of that story? He gets to decide who lives and who dies with all the babies. Well, at the end of this, who actually controls life? Yahweh. So it's an attack on the gods of Egypt. John does something similar with the signs of Jesus. Each one he does is greater and more grander and just puts to shame any of the gods or any of the things that people would worship in John's time. We'll point those out as we go. Dionysus is the first one to fall in John's gospel. But as I was thinking about this, I started thinking about how John tells this and how the other gospels tell their stories. If you think about John compared to the other gospels, what stands out to you? Other than it's different. What stands out to you? Maybe what's missing or what's included or how John tells something versus how others tell something. Oh, help me out. I'm really trying not to talk all class. Yeah. Yeah, they're all writing to slightly different audiences. They're all, you know, why do you write something? Well, you've got an audience in mind that you want to help them. Or engage with them. That's what authors do. They have an audience in mind. Each one of them has an audience. John's is much different than the others. He's writing much later. There's decades that pass between the other Gospels and John. He's writing much later, and so he's got a different audience, a slightly different focus. So yes, you're exactly right. What else might be different between John and the other Gospels if you've read them or familiar with them? Say it again. The ways he refers to Christ are a little bit different as well. Absolutely. And I'll add on to that, the way that Jesus refers to himself are a little bit different, isn't it? Where do we have, well, I'll just give it to you, John, right? The way, the truth, and the life. You don't see that phrase in the other Gospels, although it's certainly hinted at, right? It comes out a little bit differently. I am the bread that comes down from heaven. That's unique for John. I am the good shepherd. That's unique from John. So he speaks about Jesus in a different way with what he includes. Anything else that you notice that's different? Say it again. His first miracle is very different. Thank you for landing on that. You see the stories of Jesus told in different orders. John does a whole lot of re-chronologizing. He plays with the chronology of the story of Jesus, the timeline. All the Gospels do this, and they do it for different reasons. We tend to like to tell stories very linearly. We want to start at the beginning. If you were going to write a biography of George Washington, you probably wouldn't start when he was in 4th grade and then go to his death and then go back to 1st grade and then go to his birth and then go back to when he's in his 30s. You know, we don't tend to do that. In the ancient world, when you tell a story, it's very much that because you're going thematically, not chronologically. That's a much later invention. Keep in mind you're in a world that really doesn't have stopwatches or timers or anything, right? What time is it? Yeah, we got a few hours left of daylight. Okay. So it's a different type of telling. John really shuffles it differently than the other Gospels. And he puts a miracle first. I love the way that Eddie said it. The first miracle is water to wine. Now think again to the Exodus. Does anybody remember the first public sign that Moses does? No, not the parting of the Red Sea. He turns water to blood, doesn't he? Go to Exodus chapter 7. In Exodus chapter 7, we're going to be in verse 14. Moses gets to figure out a little bit with God. He gets to do some test miracles. Do you remember that? Where the Lord's telling him, hey, I'm going to be with you, and this is what I'm going to do. Take your staff, throw it down on the ground, right? You know, hey, stick your hand inside your coat and pull it out. Woo, put it back in. Okay, yeah, you're good now, right? But that's not public. That's between Moses and the Lord, and Moses is going, wow, okay, the Lord is enabling me to do things far greater than I can ever do myself. Well, the first public display he does is when he goes and he tells Pharaoh, hey, let my people go. So this is verse 14 of Exodus chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the river, confront him on the bank of the Nile, and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, the river will stink, the Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff, stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs. They will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in vessels of wood and stone. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water changed to blood. The fish in the Nile died. The river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. How fun does that sound? Nasty. Anybody in here deer hunters? A few? No? Okay. Okay, a few, right? How pleasant is the experience of cleaning a deer? Is it your favorite thing to do? Not so much, right? Maybe eating it, maybe hunting it, getting it ready. Ugh. I've never been a big deer hunter. I've hunted other things in my life quite a bit, but not deer. I helped my cousins do that quite a bit, though. I love that. It's gross. Yeah, no better way to do it, right? You get messy. There's blood everywhere. Ugh. Now, imagine you trying to clean yourself up, and you have to clean yourself up using blood. That's all there is. You can't bathe. You can't drink it. Everything stinks. P.S. You live on a river in the middle of the desert. Where do you think you get most of your meat from? The fish, which are now floating dead in the blood. Everything's dead and smelly. Yay. So Moses' first sign is turning water into essentially death. Jesus' first miracle is turning water into what? Wine. And what does wine represent? Life, blessing. It's all over your Old Testament. It's all over your Old Testament. It's in the Proverbs, it's in the Psalms. God blesses us with bountiful wine. It's a promise of the promised land. When the people are looking forward to getting out of captivity and out of the desert and out of the wilderness wanderings, you're going to go into this new land. There's going to be great. Do you remember what they come back carrying, the spies come back carrying? Grapes as big as your head. It's huge. What do you make with grapes in that day and time? Wine. There's no other way to preserve them. You can't keep them around. Yeah, you can eat some, but you turn it into wine. This is God's blessing. God's curses came through Moses. God's blessing comes through Jesus. Death came through Moses. Life comes through Jesus. Again, go back to John chapter 1. And what does John tell us about Moses? It's John chapter 1. We're going to start in let's start in 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Verse 16, out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John doesn't have to hammer it, because Paul's already written. What does Paul say about the law? Does it give life? No. It points out our sin. It makes us guilty. And the wages of sin is, the law brings us death. Moses brought us death. Christ, he brings us life. John's telling us the same thing, but he does it in a very Jewish way. And so the order of the miracles is very different, and it's for a very different purpose. We end up getting a little bit of a tension, I guess you would say, more of a tension in John's gospel between, how do I put this? If you've been around here any amount of time, I hope you realize I really like the Old Testament. And I really think it's important and that we need to know it and follow it. So I want to be careful with how I say this. John is trying to show us not the de-emphasis of our Old Testament, but the de-emphasis of the old system. John's church is being challenged from pagans to leave Jesus, yes? But John's church, more than the rest of the Gospels, John's church is now at odds with even the Jewish community, because they have started to turn against the Christians. And so when Matthew is writing, he's writing his gospel to show you how Jewish Jesus is. He tells the story of Jesus like the story of Moses, except Jesus is a greater Moses. John does the same thing, but does it in a different way. With Jesus, you get the story of Israel lived out. Israel goes down into Egypt, yes? In Matthew's gospel, where does Jesus go as a newborn? Down to Egypt to escape what? A king who's killing all the babies. Sound like the Moses story, anybody? And then out of Egypt he comes through the wilderness testing, he comes through the waters of John's baptism, and then he goes up on a mountainside and gives God's law. Moses received the law, Jesus gives it. He's greater. John starts with the same miracle but different. Moses' first miracle was water to death. Jesus is his water to blessing and to life. You get to the same point, but you notice it kind of distances itself. And further as we go into John's gospel, you're going to start getting this phrase, the Jews. If we're not careful, we will wind up like Martin Luther. Anybody know who Martin Luther is? He's the one who knows how to throw a real Halloween party. If you don't get that joke, he nailed his 95 thesis, his 95 grievances against the church in his time to the door in Wittenberg, the church door, and you're going, how dare you nail something to a church door? It was the bulletin board. It was Facebook of its day and time. You posted everything there and everybody knew your business, okay? If you lost your dog, you'd post it on the church door and everybody go, oh, Jerry's missing his dog. Okay, we'll look for Jerry's dog, okay? He posted it because he wanted discussion on it. He posted it on October 31st. First trunk or treat we did here, I came dressed as Martin Luther and nobody got it. So, Martin Luther had grievances against the church of his day and time, and very rightly so. It had become very corrupt. It had lost its way. It was focusing on things that were very not biblical, and Martin Luther wanted to get people back to following the Bible. Worthy goal. Wonderful goal. However, he spent an awful lot of time with John's gospel, and Martin Luther got so focused on John's gospel that every time John said the Jews, Martin Luther started hating the Jews more. And instead of looking at them and going, you know what? We need to reach these people because they don't know about Jesus, and yet Jesus came to save them. He said, they're the enemy. They killed Jesus. Now that was in Germany in 1500s. Fast forward about 400 years and you've got somebody else who used Martin Luther's words and used the church as an instrument of exterminating an awful lot of Jews. We tend to think about the Nazis and go, man, they had nothing to do with church. Nope. They had a lot to do with church. And they co-opted the church to go along with their will and encouraged the church to say certain things and preach certain texts and avoid certain texts so that we'll put God's stamp of approval on what we're doing. My goodness. Occasionally you'd have pastors that would stand up and go, this ain't right. And they get put to death in the same camps. I don't know why I got into that, but that's where my mind went to. We've got to be careful with how we use John's gospel. We have to look at it in its context. And where Matthew is writing, and Jesus is the Messiah for all of us, he's writing to a Jewish audience, we're all Jews, hey, let's continue to work on this. John's is decades later, and now the Jews want nothing to do with the Christians. There's active persecution going on. There's fighting going on. There's name calling. There's shaming. There's abandon your faith in Jesus and come back to the Old Testament the way that you ought to. And John does his best to point out, look, it's not that the Old Testament didn't matter. It's not that what God did back there was not important. It's what he's doing right now in the life of Jesus and in the life of the church that's the most important. This is where we all need to be. Don't you dare turn your back on Jesus because it's easier to go somewhere else. That's the message he's writing. And if we're not careful, we can look at John's gospel and go, man, he hates the Jews. Know the context, know the situation there. I'm tired of talking. Questions, comments, anybody? Yes, sir, go for it.
You talk about John tells about Revelation book. A lot of people won't read it with Revelation because it's more sci-fi.
That's a good way to put it.
I mean,
Yeah.
I ran into a guy who told me, he said, I asked him, "Do you read Revelation?" He said, "No, we win anyway, so why read it?"
Yeah. I like that. If you couldn't hear what Eddie said, he said a lot of people won't read Revelation. John wrote it because it's very sci-fi. I like the way he put that. It's very sci-fi. Somebody he talked to said, why would I read it? We win anyway. Who cares? Okay, I get it. I get the sentiment. The problem with us and our reading of Revelation is that we are so far removed from the language that John writes in, the way that John tells his story. Okay? Imagine for a moment having no knowledge of Star Wars whatsoever. To you, it doesn't exist. And all of a sudden, people start talking to you in Star Wars imagery and dropping names and mentioning lightsabers, and you're like, what the heck is a lightsaber? And you're all of a sudden supposed to understand all that imagery and get exactly what they're saying. The fall of Vader. Vader who? If you don't understand the story, you don't understand the imagery. John is the master of weaving Old Testament imagery into Revelation. Let me ask you a question. There's a dragon in Revelation? If I were to tell you there's dragons in your Old Testament, do you think we ought to understand what the dragon in the Old Testament means before we start trying to make some meaning out of the one in the New Testament? Okay? That's a problem. How about stars falling from the sky? Do we have that in Revelation? Do we have it in our Old Testament? It's in the prophets. Maybe we ought to understand what the prophets were saying when they used that word before we start trying to assume what we know in our New Testament. And this is not shaming anybody, and this is not Matt claiming I know all the answers. Please understand, I do not. Okay? What my experience has been is when we dive into Revelation studies, a lot of people want to go, well, you know what this makes me think of? It makes me think of, and they take to something in their time. Ooh, the mark of the beast, that must be something in my time. Yet John writes Revelation and specifically says, I'm writing this so the persecuted church I'm writing to finds hope. What kind of hope does it give you if John is writing to you persecuted about something that'll happen 2,000 years in the future? I guess maybe it gives you a little hope. But what I'll tell you is that John's writing in Revelation, the way that I read it, is about what his church is experiencing and about finding hope through it. And in that, we find an application to our day. There have been people who have looked at Revelation and they have said, oh, this is 100% about the Catholic Church and Luther. They've read it and said, this is 100% about the American Civil War. This is 100% about World War I, the war to end all wars. There will never be another war. This is Armageddon. They said it about the Second World War, that surely this is the war that will end all wars. This is Armageddon. And I think the reason we latch on to that is because the Bible was written for us. It was not written to us. If we understand what John is writing, who he's writing to, and what he is writing it for, we understand that and we can apply that to our contexts. P.S. I have been on a journey for the last couple of years preparing notes for Revelation. We are going to look at it, Lord willing, tentatively this summer. But I really want us to take a look at it and not do so in a right interpretation, wrong interpretation. I want us to look at it. What is John trying to communicate to his church? Great. Now what can we learn from it? What can we take from that message and look at our lives and go, okay, this is how we should live in light of that? Not a, what is this, well, what in our world is it? I found most of those not very helpful because it gets me all freaked out and worried. And what does John say? I'm writing this so that you will find peace and hope. If we read Revelation and we walk away all freaked out, I'm going to guess we haven't read it right. Or John wrote it incorrectly, and I think the Holy Spirit moved him to write it exactly correctly. Okay, enough on Revelation. That's not our study for today. It is our time of fellowship. We're going to be in John chapter 2. If you were not here for first service, we're going to be looking at that story of water to wine and what Jesus is telling us and what John is telling us about Jesus. In the meantime, find somebody that, well, lives a lot like Jesus and loves Jesus. That's here in this building. Greet them, say hi to them, especially somebody you don't know, and we will gather back for worship in about 15 minutes. God bless.